really great for me, right? Of course, really great for me to be here in such a favourite place of mine and my dad's. So many years we spent here. And I'm reminded for tonight's talk that when people come up to me so often on the Antiques Roadshow, or indeed they stop me in the street and they say to me, "Oh, I hope you don't mind me saying you're so like your dad." And I don't mind at all because I can't imagine a greater compliment to be said that because he and I really truly are. I am a chip off the old pot. We're so like each other. And it's been wonderful for me to think today about his life and his great achievements and to remember it all. So I'm going to just share that with you all today. So let's start the show. And remember, indeed, Henry Sandon, because it's a year since he passed away on Christmas Day a year ago, but he's so much with us here in the museum. So, and we've done so many things together. Let's get the slides to move on. Yeah, of course, I mean, his background, I suppose inevitably it was never pottery or porcelain to begin with. His life was music, and right from the early age, music features so much in all that he did. His family had their own orchestra, and these early shots of him, he's playing the violin there, but don't be fooled by that. He couldn't play a note on it. It was all staged. His dad was great for staging press photographs, and the star of the thing was the dog. And his father trained the dogs for the stage and for silent films. Bob and Bob 2, they were the two great dogs that, that led Dad into a career as a child film star, because these are all stills from his films. He was usually the baby that was kidnapped and was rescued then by the dog, or they got up to all sorts of tricks. In the mid-1930s, Henry starred in a wonderful silent film, The Cockney Kid. He was Britain's answer to Charlie Chaplin, I think, playing alongside Bob the dog. But it was always the dog that got the celebrity. And sadly, not a single one of these films survives, so we can't watch the lives. We just enjoy the stills of his early life on the streets of Soho, where he grew up. And Bob's greatest film was the legendary Thief of Baghdad, Alexander Korda's amazing film from 1939. The Bob, of course, Sabu was turned into the dog, and that was Bob's great act. And it's a legendary film. There in the still, talking to John Justin there is my grandfather, Henry's dad, and between them is the dog who was appearing there. Dad went along to much of the recording days and at the film. He was madly in love with June Dupre. And he appeared in a few of the, as an extra in several of the scenes, but sadly they got cut out, so we don't have any film of Dad in the Thief of Baghdad. But it was great growing up in the world of cinema of the time. But sadly, it all came to an end with the war. 1940, the film came out, and then Dad was evacuated from the centre of London. He went to High Wycombe, where he was at grammar school there. And after the war, he joined the National Service here in his barracks in Devizes, being taught the joys of becoming a soldier, which never was Dad's thing at all. He found the perfect way to skive was to join the concert party. A bit like that, it ain't half hot, mum. That film, that TV show. He was always appearing in the concert parties, putting on a stage show with his wonderful bass voice. And he knew really from then on that it wasn't the career for him wasn't the army. It was going to be music. And he returned to London just after National Service and started with singing. He received a wonderful honour of the degree from the Royal College of Music, and he sang in most of the old Wren churches around London, including St Paul's, where he joined the voluntary choir for many evensongs. And it was to him the spirit of the old church architecture was wonderful, and the sound of choral music, and that was going to be his life from then on. And this is, of course, what brought him to Worcester. He came to Worcester in coronation year, that was in early 50s. He needed a job, and the great cathedral at Worcester needed a lay clerk. And so he came along to the auditions there and got the job at singing in Worcester Cathedral Choir, augmented by a teaching job at the Royal Grammar School in Worcester. So Henry was now a master at the grammar school and singing in the choir, and brought the joy of music. He lived in the house there, the Bishop's Palace, right next to the cathedral. He had a little flat there. And it was so much history all around. And he was really part of all the music scene in Worcester. He conducted the various local groups. He conducted the St John's Choral Society, which was one of the great singing groups. And he also conducted the Worcester Police Male Voice Choir. In order to conduct the police choir, he had to become a special policeman, though he did 21 years of completely unsolved crime. He never arrested anybody. But he did, on points duty, cause the biggest traffic jam in Worcester's history when he tried to conduct the traffic at the cross. But his police career was much more involved in the conducting the orchestras and the choral societies. And one of the sopranos in the St John's Choral Society made a great impression on Dad, Barbara Starkey, there, and they were married 1955 in the Great Worcester Cathedral. This is their wedding. Their wedding night was spent, Dad, after the wedding service, he rushed over to Birmingham to sing live for the BBC Midland Singers, a live radio broadcast of Hugh the Drover. And the fee for that paid for the Birmingham Railway Hotel for their wedding night. And it was music all the way, and the wonderful life of the cathedral. And as a happily married couple in Worcester, 3 young boys soon followed. I was one of a twin, myself and Peter, and my other brother, David. And of course, they kept my mum very busy. In those days, you weren't it wasn't usual for the father to attend the birth of the children. So while we were all being born in Longswood Hospital, Dad kept well out of the way and decided to go digging in the back garden. His new hobby was archaeology. And in his back garden in Dean's Way, next to the cathedral, he dug down a few deep holes and found bones of skeletons lying there. These were the bones of Roman soldiers, and next to their bones were the pots that they were buried with. And he reconstructed the pots and had great fun. A bit of a shock finding when Mum came back from the hospital with carrying a baby. Dad was presented her with a skull from the garden, which was a little bit frightening. They had an inquest on the poor fellow, proved he had died during the Roman times. And it was the pots that came up with him that really got Dad interested. The wonderful thought that these pots were used by the Romans, by the medieval monks who built the cathedral, and these were their pots. This great jug from France was... lose the interruptions. Hopefully you're not getting any interruptions on your screen. This pot came out of the bottom of a well in 160 pieces and amazingly reconstructed. It's now in the City Museum. So ancient pottery, the older, the better. And this became Dad's hobby. Here with a friend of his, Hugh Russell from Malvern. They used to go digging together, and they as a hobby went up to London regularly to the auctions at Sotheby's, at Phillips and Bonhams, buying job lots of antiquities, Egyptian and Greek and Roman pots for £5 a box. And they would keep one or two and sell a few in local antiques fairs. Dad found these amazing, especially musical instruments, the little pot. Some of the ones on the bottom are pieces that he bought when he was, he got these in the early 1960s. There's an ocarina there from Costa Rica he used to play. He bought a box from Harry Wolff in Dealer in Droitwich. He bought a box of Peruvian pots for £25, 7 amazing pots from 1,000 years old from the Andes. And these were wonderful. And he took them to the British Museum and Birmingham Museum, plaguing the curators there to tell him all about them. And he learned so much from these old pots. Rather different. He went along to an auction in Birmingham. I think he bought the wrong lot, but he bought a mug that was described as a Worcester porcelain mug. And he thought, well, being in Worcester, it'd be interesting to have a piece of local porcelain. He'd heard that there was porcelain made in Worcester, but didn't know anything about it, and came home with this cracked mug with a fruit print and bird print on it. It cost him £5, I think. And so he thought, I'd better learn about this. And to do so, he took it to the obvious place in Worcester, the Dyson Perrins Museum, which he hadn't heard about before, but he turned up there with this mug in a box and showed it to the then old curator, Cyril Shingler, who had been the curator there since the 1950s. This was in 1965. And that was a bit disappointed, shocked almost, when Cyril told him, actually, that mug isn't Worcester at all. It's Caughley. It's made by the Worcester's rival factory. It isn't Worcester. And he explained why the difference is that they made it, they had a C mark on the bottom instead of a crescent. And Dad found this very interesting indeed. Especially when Cyril told him that he'd been they just knocked down the old factory buildings by the river, and he found a box of old shards lying on the ground. And Dad thought that would be wonderful to dig up pieces of old porcelain. And so when Cyril Shingler mentioned to Dad that I'm going to be retiring very soon, they're going to be advertising for a new curator here. And so Henry thought, well, that's good. That sounds like a great opportunity. I'd love that job. I don't know anything about Worcester porcelain, but I don't think that matters. He applied for the job, and the great Joe Jimson interviewed him and gave him the job of curator. So this was an important time for the museum here, because they were about to move from the old 19th century Victorian building where the museum had been since then. Dyson Perrins had given his collection, and combined with the Worcester factory, it had outgrown the old museum, and it was moving. The museum acquired the ground floor lease on St. Peter's School next to the factory. Dad's first job as the curator was to move all the collection from the one building to new cases to work out a new arrangement and displays in the new building. It had formerly been St. Peter's School, which was appropriate because my mum, Barbara, had been a pupil as a little girl in the school when it was formerly in its previous life. And this is her next to the Chicago vase. It was rather larger than she was. Mum wasn't terribly big, but the vase used to stand open and freely in the middle of the gallery, a bit vulnerable. Thank goodness it's behind glass now, but an amazing place. And Dad laid out the displays and started to reckon, I better learn a bit about Worcester porcelain. And of course, it was the best possible way, handling every piece as it was moved from one building to the other. And taking visitors around the museum and around the factory. That was Dad's main job. Famous visitors, and one of the earliest visitors who came along to see him there was the Prime Minister, Edward Heath, who came along with Peter Walker, the MP for Worcestershire. And between them, they're looking at the Doughty birds with Dad. Ted Heath became a great friend. He was very interested in Worcester porcelain, and he invited Dad several times to 10 Downing Street to come and help him, advise him on buying Worcester porcelain for his collection. So they always got on extremely well together. And but when visitors showed interest in the pieces, Dad wouldn't just leave it at that. Often he would, as he was doing there at Teddy, he would often open the case and take a piece out and let them handle the actual objects themselves. But then he would say, you must come and meet the people who made these. And he would take visitors into the factory itself. And there they would meet the workmen, because it was a very active factory in those days. And so many of the craftsmen, the potters, painters, decorators, had been there all their lives. And Dad learned so much from them, from Taylor and Percy Burgess, the engravers. There in the middle is Daisy Ree, who was supervising the painting of all the figurines, a grand old lady. And these workmen told Dad all about their life at the factory as he watched them work. And his greatest thrill was to be taken to the very top room high up in the factory, a little dusty, tiny room where Harry Davis was painting. Harry Davis then was in his 80s. He joined the factory in 1900 and had been the greatest painter throughout the 20th century. And there was Harry, surrounded by piles of plates and a great teetering pile of plaques. And he was painting one plaque after another with scenes of Corot. And Dad was amazed. He took me along as a young boy to watch Harry paint these plaques. It was fantastic, doing it all from his mind, from his memory, creating over several firings the effect of the painting. And Harry told Dad a lot about life in the early days. And it was sad for Harry because he didn't want to work anywhere except in his tiny room right at the top, up many very rickety flights of stairs. And the factory had to say, sorry, Harry, you can't, it's too risky, you've got to retire. And Dad organised for him in 1970 a retirement party for Harry Davis here in the museum, and invited there's Daisy Ree, there's Ivor Williams, Neil French, all the sort of great potters and craftsmen of the factory came along and said farewell to Harry. And Dad was in awe of the incredible painting that he did. But he wanted to make sure all their lives were fully recorded. So to begin with, though, it was the 18th century Worcester that attracted Dad, his fascination with the early period and the archaeology. The factory, the original 18th century buildings by Warmstry House were there next to the River Severn. They'd only just been knocked down. Terrible sadness, really, to think that the great 18th century kilns and buildings were all demolished only in the 1950s with hardly any records kept, but instead replaced by an architectural masterpiece of the Technical College, which stands there today. When Cyril Shingler had supervised the demolition of the factory, he filled 2 shoeboxes of shards from the factory, and lying around, and from the entire construction of the technical college. Dad thought, I can do an awful lot better than that. And he has set about a new archaeological excavation. And on the site of what is now the Copenhagen Street car park, he dug a trench. It took nearly 2 years across the car park from 1967-68. He dug down, right down the depth of 2 double-decker buses. It went right down into the ground, and out of the soil came tens of thousands of pieces of broken Worcester porcelain. And it was really quite amazing. Dad dug the whole thing all by himself, always wearing a suit jacket for archaeology. It was the way he did, because he would have to rush back from the hole to sing in the cathedral choir, or to get back and take an important visitor around the museum, and then come back, put some boots on, and go back down the hole, digging out more and more porcelain. And what fantastic finds came out of those excavations. Little pieces like this, because they were the things that went wrong, bits that broke and were thrown away, smashed and thrown into the mud beside the river. And there in the ash and the mud were pieces like this, the underglazed blue part of a sauce boat in biscuit porcelain, painted in cobalt oxide before it was glazed. The glaze magically turned the black cobalt into blue and sealed it there for all time. And these fragments proved so much. They showed Dad how the Worcester porcelain was made, but also they proved that the pieces he was working with in the museum really were made at Worcester, because there's the bits they were making at the same time that went wrong. And so it proved so much. It was groundbreaking. It proved things were Worcester and things that weren't. No factory site had been excavated and learnt about in quite the same way. Amazing finds like this. Dad dug a part of the block mould of a little Rococo ornament, the part of Vulcan's forge, and it was unrecorded. He didn't know what it was. He showed it to a few other porcelain specialists. Say, anyone know what this piece is part of? It's not in any of the books on Worcester porcelain. And Dr. Bernard Watney said, oh, I've got one of those. And he reached on a shelf in his great collection, and he had a figurine that he'd bought as Longton Hall, a Staffordshire maker. But it matched up exactly the part of the mould that Dad had found at Worcester. So the figure wasn't Longton Hall at all. It was unrecorded early Worcester figure. So immediately leapt up 10 times in price, and Bernard Watney sold it to the museum, and Dad was able to persuade some local friends to cough up the money and save it for the collection. Proved to be Worcester because of the archaeology. And this was all written up in his book. The first of his great books on Worcester porcelain. He, like I, have been prolific authors writing down the history of the factory. Just 2 years after Dad had handled his first piece of Worcester porcelain, he wrote the pioneering and greatest guide to Worcester porcelain of the 18th century, and it recorded all the finds from the archaeology, and accompanied a great exhibition of the archaeological finds held in the museum here in 1969. Then, 3 years later, he produced probably one of the most important books of the 20th century on any porcelain factory, is Royal Worcester Porcelain. It told the story of Royal Worcester of the later period, the Victorians and the 20th century, but not just showing the pots and talking about the factory history. It was the lives of the workmen themselves. To produce the book, he went onto the factory and wrote down everything that he was told about the lives of the painters, the gilders, the potters, and everyone who was still working there and had been there all their life. And he gave their biographies and told their history in the book. And it was great. It really put Royal Worcester on the map. These books sold extremely well, and people who bought the books read their lives of the people and wanted to collect Worcester porcelain. It inspired so many people. And that was really Dad's way. He was so inspiring. He was marvelous at lecturing any visitor, whether it was just one or two people coming by themselves. They would get a lecture from Dad, whether they wanted one or not. And he would entertain coach parties and groups anywhere, where by taking treasured pieces from the museum and passing them around. He never minded anyone handling these pieces. There would always be anything was for passing around. And he even took some over to America in the 1970s and 1972. He gave great lecture tours of America. He did 16 cities in 16 days, absolutely exhausting, but taking the story of Worcester porcelain over to America and inspiring so many of the great collectors who put together some fantastic collections, mostly of the 18th century, but he also inspired them to like some of the later stuff too. And I grew up with all this. I suppose it's a bit like sort of night at the museum, being locked in every night. After school, at the King's School, just up the road from the museum, my brothers were in the cathedral choir. They were both choristers like Dad. I was a great disappointment because I couldn't sing a note. So instead, Dad pushed me into the following his other hobby of the porcelain museum. And while he sang evensong with my brothers, I was locked in the museum for an hour or two while he gave the evening service, and then would come out and let me out. And during that time, I would be looking through the old factory archives and order books and pieces in the storeroom, sorting them out and organising photographs and learning myself all about the Worcester porcelain. It was a fantastic way for me to learn. Learning about the pieces. And the collection was fantastic. Of course, it covered the whole history of Worcester, but there were obvious gaps in any collection. And Dad was determined to try and fill some of these gaps. And he wanted to add pieces to the collection. He saved many pieces. Probably the greatest achievement in that respect was acquiring for the museum the Wigornia creamboat. This legendary piece, the only one known with the word Wigornia written on the bottom. That's the Latin name for the city of Worcester. At the King's School, I was an old Wigornian. Wigornia was proudly saying, this little sort of creamboat that looks Chinese isn't anything Chinese at all. It was made in Worcester. And it was the only one. It was coming up for sale at Sotheby's in London, 1973, from an American collection. And Dad was determined to try and buy it. He had a word with every possible benefactor and had a little funds available and went to the auction hoping to get it for around £10,000, but it went well above that and went up to £20,000, which back then was a huge sum of money, and Dad wasn't able to get it. He came back very disillusioned. But the buyer, the London dealers, Winifred Williams, said, look, if you can match the price for the museum, we'd like you to have it. So match, if you can give us £20,000, you can have it for the museum. And he only had a week to do that. So he had to then go begging around every possible collector in Worcestershire and around, give us some money for the Wigornia creamboat. They made the target, and the piece here is probably the most prized item made here, the first Worcester creamboat, and a very special piece that Dad was able to save. And I mean, it wasn't just that. I mean, he knew there were lots of pieces. The museum had virtually no Chamberlain porcelain. It had nothing from Granger at all. And so he acquired pieces from the ordinary bits from the lesser factories, from local families. He went begging to anyone who showed him a piece in the museum. If the museum hadn't got one, he wouldn't let them go out of the door with it. He said, no, you're going to give it to the museum, aren't you? And they all happily did. And he bought other pieces. He's bought for the museum the Chamberlain Rayner family, the musicians, a wonderful set that came up for auction in London. He was very much responsible for saving the teapot from a Nelson set, which came up for auction in London, and he was able to get that for the museum. I turned up in London in auction at the plate by Thomas Baxter of Sarah Siddons. And I told to Dad, you really got to get this for the museum. It absolutely must be. And the Friends of the Museum, he had founded as a group, was able to come up with the funds to save it and buy it for the collection. The collection was growing in a very special way. But many collectors were happy to help out. He got to know the individual collectors, but his enthusiasm was great. He would go along to collectors in their home and meet them, and always took me along too. And one collector who became a very good friend of our family and of Dad was Tom Byrne who lived at Rouse Court in Worcestershire, a great Elizabethan manor house, which he'd filled with incredible furniture and treasures and antiques of all kinds. It was the most famous, one of the great art collections of Britain. And Tom Byrne, a great strange character, a lovely chap in many ways, lived in this huge Elizabethan house with his manservant James and their poodles. And my mum had a poodle, and we used to go along for poodle parties with Tom Byrne and James there. There's me in front of the incredible medieval fireplace that came back from, that was part of one of the great American collections. He filled it with slipware, delft, every possible treasure. And Dad would take me along there almost every week. And I would go around and look at these antiques and these objects and learn from them. It was an amazing place. In the upstairs room was the porcelain gallery, full of Chelsea, Longton Hall, and especially Worcester porcelain. Dad took Ted Heath along to visit, and he took Ted Heath into this porcelain room. There, on the left is one of two great harpsichords, and Ted Heath gave an impromptu concert on the harpsichord there, with Dad singing along. That was an amazing night. It really was. But above all, when Tom Byrne got on in years, that persuaded him that he had to give some of the porcelain to the museum. And Tom Byrne left to the museum a choice of half a dozen pieces for the collection. And so Dad, how do you choose out of a collection like that which pieces you want for the museum? He chose very wisely and carefully perhaps the two of the most rarest candlesticks, the only known pair with their sconces of 18th century Worcester candlesticks. The jug and basin there with the bird and snail pattern, and rather more simple but so important, the medallion of Nelson by Thomas Baxter. So these pieces joined the museum through Dad's great enthusiasm. One regular visitor to the museum and to the Rouse Lynch collection particularly was Arthur Negus. Arthur, a great friend, became a great friend of Dad's, and he introduced Dad to the world of television. Initially on Dad's first appearance on TV as a guest expert on the programme Going for a Song. There. So Dad, at 40, becomes a new career for him of television personality. And he got on so well with Arthur Negus. They did a series together, Arthur Negus Enjoys. And they were two of a kind. They really were. They were enthusiasm for what they did. And Arthur then introduced Dad to a new programme that they were just launching, in 1979, the Antiques Roadshow, the idea of taking some experts around to village halls and town halls and inviting the public to bring along their antiques and to talk about them. Here with Angela Rippon, the new presenter. And Dad joined the programme in 1980 and was immediately a hit with the public. He was very similar to Arthur Negus, and their enthusiasm just hit it off so well indeed. This was Dad's very first programme that he recorded. This was the first piece that he televised, was talking about, and by chance, it's a Caughley mug. He knew what it was because he'd had one himself that he'd learned from Cyril Shingler what it was those years before. And so he was able to explain to this young man that it was indeed Caughley, not Worcester, and it was broken, and it was then worth £15 rather than £5. And a little bit timid start, but it got Dad off and a new career with the Antiques Roadshow. I, meanwhile, had moved on as soon as I could leave school at 16. I didn't want to go on to university or any other formal study. The world to me was porcelain. I'd learned so much from my dad that I had the opportunity to go to London. I went to Bond Street to Phillips when I was just 16 and became an expert there in porcelain of all kinds. And learned there from handling real pieces about Meissen and about Chinese and everything else with a firm grounding that I had in Worcester porcelain from there. And that was going to become my life. And Dad was so proud and pleased for me that I was able to follow him in his footsteps of loving handling ceramic items. But of course, I came back to Worcester quite a lot from London and helped Dad a lot. I came down to Worcester regularly, mainly to bring my washing, but also to help out on further excavations on the site. This was 1980. We dug another hole in the Wormsbury House site. Got a few friends from London came along and helped. That's a very young Eric Knowles there with his first moustache there. He just joined the Antiques Roadshow and he came along and helped on the excavation. And 2 or 3 weeks in the bottom of a very muddy hole is a great way to get to know somebody, especially one American student who was helping out and was wonderful with a pickaxe and could dig a shovel better than any of us. And so 2 years later, Christine and I got married all because of that mud on the banks of the River Severn there in Worcester. Dad, meanwhile, carried on with the Antiques Roadshow, and it was so successful. Here he is looking at another piece of Caughley porcelain rather than Worcester, a little tiny chamber pot. The lady brought along to the roadshow down in Cornwall. I didn't know what it was, tiny little thing, just a couple of inches, toy chamber pot. And Dad shocked her by telling her it was worth £800. And no one believed a tiny chamber pot like that can't possibly be worth £800, not back then. But she said, "Oh, I'll never sell it though." But a couple of months later, it turned up in an auction in London, and it sold for £1,200. And Dad said, "I told you so. I knew it was valuable." And a special find. He had a knack of turning up these incredible treasures and doing it so enthusiastically. That was what he did so well. I joined the Antique Roadshow too. Nepotism gets you anywhere. And so I joined the show in 1985. So I was a newcomer then. But the great thing was sitting together with Dad, doing it together, working side by side and learning from him, not just about the pots themselves, but about how to put it nicely to the owners, to have fun with the pots. I took them rather too seriously. Instead, Dad was able to show me how to really see the lighter side of a piece of pottery and to chat with owners about pieces that weren't worth anything, and to be able to send them away happy just by sharing their love for the objects that they own. And this we did. The roadshow was shown all over the world and was hugely successful. Dad became very well known in other countries, and then in 1983 he was headhunted by the George Gardner Museum in Toronto, a new museum of ceramics, one of the great ceramic museums of the world, and he became their first director and went over to Toronto. So a sad day for Worcester Museum indeed. He left the museum and went over to Toronto and became the director there. And he was there for a year, and it was an amazing opportunity. He couldn't really let it up. It didn't work out on the long term. After a year, he came back to England, and the museum went in different directions. And he came back then to find that his life now as a freelance expert was sharing his love with the public. He came back to the Antiques Roadshow and as a lecturer, giving lectures all over the country and talks and writing a few more books about antiques and porcelain. 1989 is a most amazing find along to the Antiques Roadshow in Northampton. A lady brought along a little pottery jug in the shape of an owl. The head lifts off and forms a drinking cup. In the body, it holds strong liquor, and it lived by the fireplace. It just was part of the family. And Dad was able to explain that this was an incredible piece of early Staffordshire slipware made in the 1690s. And Ozzy the Owl, as she called it in the family, became as famous as the roadshow itself. He told her with shock that it was worth £20,000. One of those great roadshow moments. She brought it along to the show on the bus. She said, "You better take it home in a taxi." And it was treasured for a few more months. She was scared stiff at the value, and then brought it to me in London a few months later, saying, "Remember this from the roadshow? Your father had the owl. Can you sell it for me?" And we put it in the auction. It sold for £20,000, the value that he put on it, and was bought by Stoke-on-Trent Museum, the Potteries Museum now. Ozzy has his own case there. He's the most famous pot in Britain, I think. Certainly the most famous piece of Staffordshire, all because of the Antiques Roadshow. But the roadshow was going from strength to strength. I was now fairly part of the team. Angela Rippon was replaced initially by Hugh Scully as the presenter, and then later Michael Aspel came along as the new presenter. Regularly 15 million people would tune in every week to watch the Antiques Roadshow. And it made minor celebrities of some of its stars. This was, let's see if we can get this to play.
It's buffering.
There we go.
The bus gave man an armor buyer. He could do his job and never shirk. The bus gave man an armor buyer. With a little bit of luck, with a little bit of luck, God would have built a place. With a little bit of luck, never worked.
A special program for children in need. Roadshow experts performing songs from My Fair Lady. Dad's musical career, he always wanted to play the part of Doolittle, and he never got to do it except on that memorable little bit for children in need. But the roadshow went on, and then with the next presenter, Fiona Bruce. And Dad was then so. was the great celebrity of the show. Everybody came along. There were long queues for all the tables at the roadshow, but a special queue just to come and meet Henry Sandon. Everybody wanted to. He was really the face of the Antique Roadshow, and it really made so many people keen to collect porcelain and ceramics of all sorts, and led to other things. I mean, nowadays, anyone on TV suddenly becomes a celebrity and appears on other programs. This was Dad was one of the really first to do that. He was always in demand on other programs. He went on The Weakest Link there with Anne Robinson. He didn't do terribly well, but then he had great fun arguing with the presenters of all these shows. He was invited onto a special episode. He appeared as himself on The Green Grass. He told Boise there that a chamber pot wasn't really Ming, but it was made in Birmingham. And he appeared also as himself in The Archers when an Antique Roadshow went to Ambridge. Some of the guest appearances he perhaps prefers to forget about. On the bottom right there, it was a late night Channel 4 program called Club X, when he was interviewed about antiques by a legendary drag queen called Regina Fong. He thought all copies of the program were deleted, but it still survives somewhere on the internet, and I had a great fun finding this recording for him. But above all, I think he was much more really pleased when he was asked to join another TV show, a long-running one. He was asked to present Songs of Praise. And this really united his two great loves, music and the cathedral, with the chance to meet ordinary people. And that he did so well. He presented programmes from Worcester, there in the cricket ground, where he'd watched so many great games in the city, and also from the choir stalls of the cathedral, where he had sung for so many years. And on another occasion, I was partly involved in the subterfuge, but we arranged, Michael Aspel appeared during an interview with Eric Knowles about porcelain and presented Dad with a big red book and said, "This is your life." And he went back to the studio, and we had an amazing evening talking about Dad's long career with guests from the world of television, including a cameo from the Prime Minister. It was a lovely evening indeed. Dad was asked, what pot would you most like to have and find and have brought along to the Antique Roadshow? And without hesitation, he said, well, the one I want more than anything else to see is the Bradman vase. It was a vase painted by Harry Davis, made at Royal Worcester. When Don Bradman, the Australian cricketer, they came to Worcester, and to celebrate the great achievement for Bradman, he scored 3 consecutive double centuries, one year after the other, against poor Worcester in the cricket ground. And his third double century was recorded in the local papers in this photograph, and Harry Davis copied it onto a most amazing vase that was given to Don Bradman. Dad had been in communication, writing to Don about it on many occasions to value it. It had been risked being damaged in an earthquake, and Dad said, I really want to see that vase. So we arranged it. Eventually, Dad and I we were invited to go and give a lecture tour in Australia. This was 20 years ago. And there's so many great collections of Royal Worcester in Australia. I know some of our Australian friends are listening to the talk tonight. They know there's plenty of Stinton vases there. We spent a lovely few weeks going around there. We managed to see a koala bear, which Dad was convinced was stuffed. But we had a great time. But more than anything, Dad just wanted to get to see the Bradman vase. They wouldn't let him take it home. He was most disappointed. He says, it belongs with me. It belongs in the museum in Worcester. But here it is in Don Bradman's museum in Adelaide. and Dad was able to see for himself the greatest painting that Harry Davies did, and Dad was really in heaven seeing that one there. He's holding a little figure that he'd had made of Don Bradman as a candle snuffer. He was involved in so many different ceramic ventures. He's modelled as Toby Jugs by Keith Francis, by other potters produced likenesses of Dad. And he was involved with Lorna Bailey, with Anita Harris, other manufacturers, encouraging them in keeping the industry alive, and particularly Bronte Porcelain, a small factory in Malvern who produced wonderful porcelain, some of the finest model porcelain of recent years. They made the little figurine of Dad there holding Ozzy the Owl. And one piece that they produced at Bronte was a model of Balmoral Curlew. This was the Queen's own, one of her favourite horses. From endless photographs, they captured the spirit of the horse, and Dad was proud to be able to go along to present the piece to the Queen. And she was so touched because it really was the horse that she knew and loved so much. Dad had been honoured to meet the Queen on a number of occasions. He'd been invited a couple of times to lunch with her and with Prince Philip at Buckingham Palace when he'd inspected all the porcelain in the Royal Pantry and the collection. And he was invited again to come back for a special occasion at Buckingham Palace when he was presented by the Queen with the MBE. So he was Henry Sandon MBE for his services to charity, for his lectures, and his services to the ceramic industry, because he did so much to help and support and promote ceramics in Britain. This piece here by Dennis China Works, Sally Tuffin designed a dish to celebrate his 80th birthday. He was still an active expert on the Antiques Roadshow at 80, and Barbara and my family gathered together around the table at the roadshow when Fiona Bruce brought him a cake in the shape of, inevitably, Ozzy the Owl, who had become his trademark by this time. And still very much involved in lecturing and broadcasting at the age of 80. And this is why. I hope I'll be able to play this. Let's see if we go back. Can you get this to play? Just see if will it play. That's good. There we are. No, now he's on Dad on the Antique Roadshow. He was 85 when he did that recording, and loved his porcelain just as much then as he had when he was 40, when he first had his pieces of Worcester come along. I've followed him on the Antique Roadshow. He sadly now had to leave the show in the end because he was just too old to be able to carry on going to the show, but he kept meeting the visitors there and just having a chat with people about their objects and their pots. He was now the great elder statesman of Worcester. He was honoured by a portrait of him in the museum here. He was an honorary curator emeritus, and just liked to come along to the museum and meet the public and just share his love of the place. He was particularly pleased when, as part of the great redevelopment of the area here, the old museum, the original 19th century Dyson Perrins Museum, was renamed Henry Sandon Hall in his honour, and he opened it there with the Mayor of Worcester in a special event. And of course, where else but to have celebrate his 90th birthday, we had a party for him in Henry Sandon Hall. And on the roadshow, Fiona Bruce brought yet another cake with Ozzy the Owl on it. What else do you put on the top for Henry there? His last appearance here in the museum, when he was 93, he came along and he and I gave a talk together on Dad's life in music for the Free Choirs Festival, sharing his two great loves And at 94, he helped unveil the plaque down by the river on the site of the old porcelain works where he had done the memorable excavations all those years ago. So at the age of 94, 95, he spent his last years in a care home. He moved into Davenham, the Perrins house, the most appropriate place because it was Dyson Perrin's own home in Malvern, is now a wonderful care home. And that's where he moved in. And he was the only resident there whose room in the care home was surrounded with paintings by Harry Davis with medieval pots and Peruvian pots. The most amazing things there. I thankfully have his favourite pieces have now come to me, including his first one. I now have the broken Caughley mug that cost him a £5, that got him interested in porcelain all those years ago. And also this stoneware mug from Nottingham, which offers you to take a toast. It's John Smith's mug. Had it been higher and wider, it would have held more toast and cider. And Dad drinking here a toast from the old cider mug. And I know, but he'll always be drinking his toast of fine cider from a mug like this or a Worcester mug. And his memory is, of course, deep in my heart, but forever embodied in all the walls of the museum here in Worcester. Thanks very much for letting me share all my love of Dad with you all today.